Hello Cloud Gurus and welcome to this lecture. And this lecture is going to be a summary of all our exam tips for the troubleshooting section. So let's get started. So beginning with security monitoring and alerting. If a user is having trouble accessing an AWS resource, for example, if a user is struggling to access the CloudWatch dashboard, then do check that they have the correct identity access management permissions to allow them to do what they need to do. And you may have noticed a pattern emerging in this section of the course because a lot of things that can go wrong within AWS are directly related to either a user or a role not having the correct permissions to do what you want them to do. And if you have an EC2 instance which is supposed to be logging to CloudWatch logs and for some reason it's not logging, then do check that the agent is installed and running on your EC2 instance because it doesn't get installed by default and you're going to need to go in and install it and make sure it is running. And if you are using Lambda as an event target, so triggering an action using CloudWatch events, then do check that the event target has the correct permissions to do what it needs to do. So do check that your Lambda function has permission to take action, for example, if it needs to terminate all unauthorized instances, remove unauthorized internet gateways, isolate unauthorized instances, etc. Do make sure that Lambda has permission to do what you're asking it to do. If you are expecting to see CloudTrail logs in your S3 bucket, but they are not appearing, then do make sure the CloudTrail is enabled. And it's important to remember that the S3 and Lambda data events are extremely high volume, and so they are not enabled by default. So if you are expecting to see S3 and Lambda data events, then you're going to need to go in and enable them explicitly. So that could be another reason why they are not appearing in your S3 bucket. Do also check that you have provided the correct S3 bucket name and that you're looking for the correct bucket. And if you have a user who is having trouble accessing CloudTrail logs, do check that your user has read access to CloudTrail and there is an AWS managed policy which you can attach to your user to enable them to access the logs. Moving on to secure network infrastructure. If you are having network connectivity problems within your VPC, do make sure that your routing tables are configured correctly and that you are routing traffic to the correct NAT gateway or internet gateway, for example. Check your security groups and network access control lists are allowing the traffic. And remember, network access control lists are stateless, so you're going to need to configure both inbound and outbound rules to allow your traffic, whereas security groups are stateful and you do not need to configure both inbound and outbound. And security groups deny by default, so you can only add allow rules. And if you want to add an explicit deny, you're going to need to use network access control lists instead. If you're peering to VPCs, do remember to configure the routing tables in both VPCs, otherwise it will not work. And if you're configuring internet access, use a NAT gateway or an internet gateway. It's the NAT gateway for your private subnets and the internet gateway for public subnets. And do remember to configure your routing tables as well so that traffic destined for the internet gets routed through the NAT gateway or the internet gateway. And finally, do check your VPC flow logs to view any allow or deny messages associated with the network traffic flowing to and from your VPC. Moving on to authentication and authorization. If you are working with multiple policies, just remember an explicit deny always overrides an allow. And everything is always denied by default until you go ahead and explicitly allow it. And if you need a reminder about the policy evaluation logic, there is a really good webpage in the Identity Access Management User Guide. And I've included the link to that guide in the resources section of the course. So if you get time before your exam, definitely go in and read that just to make sure that you really understand the policy evaluation logic really, really well. For identity federation issues, make sure you're using the correct API call when assuming roles. And there's 3 different calls depending on how your users were originally authenticated. So you use STS assume role if your users were authenticated by AWS. Use assume role with SAML if your users were authenticated using a SAML 2 compliant identity provider like Active Directory. And use assume role with web identity if your users were authenticated using a web identity provider like Facebook, Amazon, or Google. For cross-account access, if you're configuring cross-account access to S3, then do check that the external account is trusted Also, the identity access management policy configured in the external account needs to allow the user to call STS assume role. And finally, the identity access management policy in the trusting account also needs to allow the action as well. And if you're configuring cross-account access to KMS, make sure that you've configured the key policy to trust the external account, as well as configuring the identity access management policy within the external account as well. Moving on to Lambda issues. If Lambda cannot perform some action, for example, it can't write to S3, log to CloudWatch, terminate instances, use a customer master key, use secrets manager, etc., then do check that the Lambda execution role has the correct permissions to perform the action you are asking it to do. And remember that some services have their own resource-based policies, which work in combination with the identity access management policies, and these will impact who or what can access them. So S3 bucket policies and key policies are really good examples. And if you're working with CloudWatch events and you cannot invoke your Lambda function using CloudWatch events, then do check that the Lambda function policy allows CloudWatch events to trigger the function. And moving on to troubleshooting access to CMKs. Remember, access to use KMS CMKs is defined by two policies. So we have the key policy, which is the resource-based policy. It's attached to the CMK and it defines the key users, key administrators, as well as any trusted external accounts. And we also have the identity access management policy, which is assigned to a user, group, or role. And this defines the allowed actions. So for example, KMS list keys, encrypt, decrypt, re-encrypt, etc. And it is the combination of these two policies which will ultimately determine whether an action is allowed or denied. So that is the end of this section, and we've tried to give you a few different troubleshooting scenarios to consider. And this is by no means exhaustive, and you will definitely see lots of different scenarios in the exam, which will really challenge your knowledge on these services. But don't worry, just try and break down what's happening in the scenario, maybe draw out a diagram if that helps you, and consider each possible answer that they give you and try to figure out if it fits the scenario and is it a possible explanation for the issue that they are describing. So that is the end of this lecture. If you have any questions, please let me know. If not, feel free to move on to the next lecture. Thank you.